I am extraordinarily honored to be part of this series. I'm grateful to Professor Bezovich and the other organizers for thinking of me and for making it such an easy lift. As many of us have probably discovered, sometimes participating in these sorts of things can end up being rather strangely much more work than you think. And that has not been the case here, and I'm very grateful to the organizers for making that the case. I'm grateful also to some of the familiar faces I see and names where there are not faces in the audience. Brother Gomberg, I owe you an email. It's good to see you. Thanks for coming. And I look forward to the Q&A, in part because there are so many familiar faces and names I see out there. That said, without any further ado, well, with only a little more ado, I will begin. The additional ado has just to do with the mechanism of presentation. I would love to have some slides for you, but I don't have any slides for you. I would love to just talk to you, but I'm not going to just talk to you. I'm going to read a bunch of stuff at you. My hope is that the reading will not be as unpleasant and painful as people reading at you sometimes can be. But if I'm wrong, if that hope is not borne out, then you can tell me at the end and I'll see what I can do about it for the next audience, and you will have done your duty for quality assurance. I am reading at you because I am working on a project. I've been working on a project for a great many years, it turns out now, almost 10 years, that as it happens dovetails very neatly with the aims and imperatives that govern this series. We've been invited to come together to think about philosophy in times of crisis. And some of the work I've been trying to do recently on this project has encouraged me to take seriously the degree to which the notion of crisis is bound up with a certain orientation to time and temporality, right? So if you think about a crisis is a thing that is urgent. It's not just important, it's urgent, right? If you don't do something bad, horribly bad things will happen. A crisis is something that comes on over time. It develops, it evolves, it grows into a crisis. And it occurred to me when I received the invitation to participate in this series that the project I was working on was in fact about, in certain ways, what a certain kind of philosopher can do anyway in a moment of crisis that seems to undermine one's attachment to the methods, the principles, the approaches that one has been raised to turn to. And so this project, I described it to my editor and anyone who would listen as a kind of crossover project. I was trying to engage, mobilize the power of words in a way that I would not ordinarily for philosophical audiences. And I'll say more about that in the talk. But I did that in part, I now realize, having gotten this invitation, as a response to something like the question that organizes this series. What does philosophy do in a time of crisis? The project grows out of one kind of answer to that. All of which is to say, this series gave me an opportunity to deepen my thoughts on the method that informs this project, such as it is. And in deference to the need to finish the project, I want to work through some ideas in something like the shape they will take in the book, hence reading at you. I beg your indulgence for that. With that, that is the last ado. I'll begin. The Christian Bible in the book of Ecclesiastes famously reports that there is a time for everything: planting and sowing, birthing and dying, scattering stones and gathering them, killing and healing. Everything has its season, this passage tells us, with an insight that properly understood reaches beyond the Christian faithful to, among other places, the deliverances of the Buddha. Whatever else it does, this passage sings of impermanence, of the inevitability of change, of the burden of adjusting human aspiration to the passing of time and the cycles of life. All of which brings me to some of the questions that my book, the project I mentioned, means to consider. There's a season for everything. What season are we in now? Now, in the United States, nearly a decade after Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, many fewer years after Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, all people whose names are well known in the United States, at least, people who have fallen to police violence, state-sponsored violence. Now, after Donald Trump and the many more mass shootings in Parkland and other places, after the COVID-19 pandemic, after all of these things mark the intervening years since Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, I am still asking what kind of time this is, what season is this? So I've already, in my choice of title, declared my sense that this is a dark time. We have declared it in this series with our willingness to talk of crisis. I'm, of course, not alone in this view, which is one reason, there will be others, I think, that I feel entitled to the we on whose behalf I raise these kinds of questions. That said, there are different ways to approach this darkness and these crises. Some of these ways are more productive and perhaps just healthier than others. American essayist Rebecca Solnit models the approach to this darkness that interests me by borrowing a challenging thought from Virginia Woolf. This is the thought that you find in the abstract for this talk. 6 months into World War I, Woolf wrote these words in her journal, and I quote her: "The future is dark, which is, on the whole, the best thing the future can be, I think." End of quotation. Rebecca Solnit uses Woolf's gesture to signal the possibilities that come with the unknown. The future is dark in the sense that one can't know what it holds. One can't see with clarity where one is headed, whether one's projects will pan out or one's hopes will be dashed. But to say all of this is to say also that the worst possibilities are not foreordained. Unanticipated wonders may await, hence the title of Solnit's own book, Hope in the Dark. There is, unfortunately, ample reason to take a dimmer view of the current darkness. I began this book, the project I keep mentioning, some years ago now after the murders of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. My editors don't want me to talk about Michael Brown as a murder victim for perfectly straightforward reasons. I will persist in doing that until people tell me not to. At that point, I meant to reflect on the idea that Black Lives Matter and on the peculiar and distressing need to keep articulating and explaining and defending this idea generation after generation in different forms of words, nevertheless, generation after generation. Then Donald Trump won the US presidency, and all that came with him came with him. And then police officers murdered George Floyd. We can use murder for that one, uncomplicated ways, and Breonna Taylor, among always others. And then US government officials, fluent in the languages of white supremacy and white grievance, called for an assault on the seat of federal power that they meant for someone to seize, so as to enshrine voter suppression and do mostly nothing about climate devastation, wealth inequality, a global pandemic, gun violence, and a great many other things. And then a gunman entered Young's Asian Massage in Atlanta and murdered 6 Asian women, including co-owner Xiao Tan and 2 others. I link all of these events because they felt linked and continue to feel linked in ways that seem to me to demand exploration and explanation, and to demand those things from something like the book I mean to write. Not just from that book, but my hope is it will contribute. The demand for explanation takes a particular form as it resonates with me. Despite being a study of time, of the moment that began in 2013 or so, study of time in the sense that one asks, it responds to the question, what season is this? What kind of time is this? Despite being a study of time, of the moment that began in 2013 or so and continues to put many people in mind of a kind of racial reckoning, my project is not an exercise in historical analysis or current events reportage. Despite in some way answering to the deaths of people like Clementa Pinckney and parishioners in South Carolina, of Philando Castile and Sandra Bland, it does not recount the tragic events or reconstruct the experiences of the participants in these terrible events. It is not a study of the legal doctrines that exonerated the killers of Trayvon Martin or Tamir Rice, or of the legal machinations that convicted Breonna Taylor's killer for doing things other than killing her. It is not a sociological study of the revival of overt white supremacy as a viable political force, nor is it a study of the shifts in material conditions that have allowed this force to get traction. It's not an expose of the organizations that have grown up during this time, like the Movement for Black Lives. It's not a report on how older institutions like the Senate and the NAACP have acquitted themselves in this moment. All of those topics bear on the project, but they do not define it. So what's left after all the things this book is not, is the kind of writing that Michel de Montaigne taught us to call essays in the 16th century. What exactly this word means and how it got from its several contemporaneous meanings to the ones we recognize is a matter for other people to take up. I'll simply invite 2 current caretakers of the form to explain where things stand now. John Jeremiah Sullivan suggested a few years ago that the key to the essay is its suspension between attempting and testing, between a try and a trial. These are familiar ideas, one much more familiar to many people than the other. Rebecca Solnit draws out that tension like this, quoting her now. The essayist's job is to gather up the shards or map them where they are, to find the pattern out there or make one with words about the disconnections and mysteries. Essays are restless literature, trying to find out how things fit together, how we can think about two things at once, how the personal and the public can inform each other, how intuitive and scholarly knowledge can cook down together, end of quote. My sense is that this moment, this combination of racial reckoning with climate devastation and with the buckling and breaking of political forms that, for good or ill, seem sturdy enough, is still unfolding. The moment is too fresh for anyone to rely completely and without hesitation on what it seems right now to be. It is in this sense fresh, like a wound, or better, like a coat of paint applied to a surface and left alone for a time, for some time, until one can rest on it with confidence. Until that time passes, until the right time comes, one could wait, or one could conduct a test in an out-of-the-way corner to see if the time has come. The turn to the essay is my sense of, or my attempt to undertake something like this test. So the turn to the essay has three implications for me, and I want to say a word about those before I play out a couple of those in the second half of the talk. First implication is this: in testing one's sense of a moment, one does what the American mystic Howard Thurman did in the book that joined Rebecca Solnit's book in inspiring my early thoughts in this direction. Thurman wrote a book called The Luminous Darkness in 1965 to provide what he called, quoting him now, a personal interpretation of the anatomy of segregation and of the ground of hope, end of quotation. Segregation meant something different then than it does now, though it still means more now than many people in 1965 hoped it would. Even then, though, Thurman thought it meant more than people understood. It involved a deeper rift than simple integration could repair. It created patterns of conduct and states of character that nearly ruined the prospects for ongoing community life. I trust there's no question now that he was right not to be overly heartened. Thurman's so-called personal mode of interpretation lines up neatly with the essayist's unique challenge. As Rebecca Solnit puts it, the essayist, quoting once more, doesn't just want to recount things that happen, but contemplate what they mean. And often what they mean is really about how they fit into the pattern. End of quote. This pattern stands revealed, it gets suggested, or attempted, or tested, and the revelation that results, as Solnit says, from what the writer chose to pay attention to. What the writer chose. This inward turn may seem self-indulgent, but it does vital ethical work if it's done properly. It involves taking oneself as representative of a way of inhabiting and registering a moment. It involves offering one's fellows one's own sense of the moment's defining patterns and submitting that sense to the trial of the reader's reactions. It involves embracing what is in some ways the hardest part of the ethical life. Ethics is, of course, importantly bound up with judgments of others, with praising and blaming, but it also requires evaluating oneself, beginning with one's judgments and one's capacity for judgment. It requires that we interrogate our actions and reactions, our thoughts and attentions, our desires and aversions to see what they mean for the way we regard and engage and echo other people. The self that judges others cannot judge rightly or even discern whether judging is appropriate unless it grapples with its own fear and pride, its own assumptions and demons, its own debts to and inheritances from the societies and cultures that have shaped it. In a slightly different world, we could now talk about therapy, or we could talk about critical theory. I'm going to talk about essays. We could also talk about meditation and mindfulness teachers. Essay writing is a way of making this turn toward the inner life and its transactions with the social world. It models this turn and recommends it for moments like the one we're in, especially when the essayists are people like James Baldwin, another profound influence on the project. One feature of this moment is the resurgence of odious political currents that many people had considered long vanquished. These currents swirl around the meanings of race and democracy and gender and sex and justice and humanity in ways that Baldwin subjected to scathing and prescient examination. I want to write about these things too, in the same or something like the same inward-looking, outward-reaching spirit of restless exploration, helping myself at every opportunity to Baldwin's ideas about racial innocence. I'll have a tiny bit more to say about that later on. Sorry, I've misplaced a page. If the first implication of turning to the essay is to turn to interiority, the second is the refusal to shroud the writer's meanings in abstraction and system. I take encouragement in this thought from Adorno, and the quote from Adorno is the page that's gone missing, but it's a famous line from the essayist form. There are a handful of places in that wonderful essay where he talks about the way the essay engages with thoughts and concepts very carefully, right? The essay does not deduce it, does not do its work as a matter of deduction from the concept or from a theory. It instead does something much more halting, something that's much more cautious, something that gives us a sort of alternative space that doesn't commit itself to the sorts of taking up the kind of baggage that comes with theory. That baggage takes on a very particular form for Adorno, as you know, and I don't want to get into any of that. The point is that this is yet another of the resources I'm stacking up to motivate this turn to the essay and to motivate some of the work that this turn can do. And some of the work this turn can do is allow us to bracket some of the sort of ritualized and specialized interrogations and encounters that come with specialized, theoretically rooted scholarly work, right? Essay writing is not beholden, right, to the rituals and the legitimating moves that we have to undertake in the academy to show that we know the right stuff and we've read the right stuff and all of that. There's a way in which the essay can bracket all of that. There's a way in which the essay can take up what a Zen priest might call beginner's mind, or what Mary Mothershill would call an openness to primitive questions, right? That's the move I'm trying to make, and the essay form is a way to make that move. Montaigne is helpful here as well. There are beautiful passages throughout his work, of course, but especially in the essay, the closing, final essay in his marvelous collection of essays on experience, where he complains about the frequency with which we write books about books, right? Instead of writing about the things the books are about. There are echoes of this thought, of course, throughout Western literature, especially for people like me and Emerson, but that is the thought I'm trying to access. One piece of that thought from Adorno that I particularly want to say in his words, I do have on the page. He says in one place, and I quote him, "Disaster threatens intellectual experience the more strenuously it, intellectual experience, ossifies into theory and acts as if it held the philosopher's stone in hand." End of quotation. I am trying to refuse the ossification of theory, to embrace a kind of humility that refuses the thought that the philosopher's stone is held in hand. So informed by sources like these, I'll say this: abstractions are useful, and I'll employ them now and again. Systems are also useful, and I've been keen to build them elsewhere. Book on aesthetics, for example. But to inhabit a moment, especially a moment of crisis, is to have an experience, which means, especially in these still early days, that the texture and the gravity of the experience must receive a hearing. I want to offer that hearing. So the third implication of turning to the essay form leads me to people like Toni Morrison. So sometimes the only way to give experience a hearing is to examine its silences and omissions. This is the third implication, the commitment to examining these silences and omissions, and it leaves me indebted not just to Solnit and Woolf, Baldwin and Thurman, Adorno and Montaigne, but also to Toni Morrison. In one of her own essays, she explains that she uses fiction writing to fill the spaces where memory fails, spaces where memory should be but is not, thanks, for example, to forced illiteracy or to destroyed municipal records. She identifies this work as, and I quote her, a kind of literary archaeology, end of quote, and she describes it like this, quoting once more: "On the basis of some information and a little bit of guesswork, you journey to a site to see what remains were left behind and to reconstruct the world that these remains imply," end of quote. This is her description of one of the methods, anyway, that informs her fiction writing, right? This is what leads to Beloved. This is what leads to Sula. She finds these remains in the emotionally rich and meaning-laden snippets of experiences, images, she calls them, that call out for imaginative reconstruction and completion. These images can be as simple, she says, as, quoting once more, a dimly recalled figure, the corner of a room, a voice, end of quote. But these images invite the reader to imagine their connections to the rest of the world, to the times that flow through and around them. They invite the writer to find words for these connections. The events of our own time leave a wealth of images like these scattered in their wake, but they've done this too recently for memory to have assembled anything more out of them than remains. Like Morrison then, though with, of course, no hope of even approaching her standard of insight and eloquence, I propose to locate some of these images, some of these remains that lie a little nearer at hand than the ones she takes up, and to experiment with ways of reconstructing the worlds that they imply. So that's the conceit that governs the project. Each chapter of the book that operationalizes the project will begin with one of these images and then look to connect it to theories and data and precedents and policy questions that connect the image to the pressing issues of our moment. And then each chapter will articulate the connections in the fragmentary experimental spirit on which the essay depends, the spirit that we hear from Adorno and Montaigne and others. That's the shape of the project. I want to work through a couple of the cases with you, for you here. Along the way, I'll try to do something like the work that these cases will do in the book. I'll link my thoughts to some of the more, in particular here, I'll link my thoughts to some of the more expressly theoretical inventions that seek to do some of the same work that I think the images do. And I want to do that in deference to the theme that organizes this series, right? We're meant to talk about and think about what happens to philosophy in moments of crisis. And one of my suggestions is that, or one of my abiding thoughts is that some of the forms of philosophical reflection that get called into being by certain features of the crisis moment, or certain ways of understanding the crisis moment, are less useful than one might want them to be, or they are at any rate less useful for people like me, and I want to say some words about why that is. So here's my first image. This is where slides would be useful. Imagine, please try to imagine for me. This is what the end of an era looks like. A beleaguered president addressing a shocked nation from a harshly lit briefing room, while the cable news outlets covering his press conference force him to share the screen with live images of protesting citizens and burning property. Or maybe it looks like this: a quarrelsome president standing in bright sunlight behind clear plexiglass barriers, addressing a crowd of protesting citizens, urging them to march to the seat of government and fight like hell to overturn the election he's just lost. The first president was, of course, Barack Obama, who on November 24th, 2014, convened a press conference to address a St. Louis County grand jury's failure to indict the police officer who killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Mr. Obama used this time to do very presidential things. He appealed for calm. He condemned violent protest. He also did Barack Obama things, or maybe they're just lawyer things or politician things, like getting very close to acknowledging the protesters' real grievances about police brutality and discriminatory policing, for example, but in words that seem to root the grievances not in actual social conditions, but in the way people feel about their conditions. One can understand the impulse to protest, he said, because, quoting him, the law too often feels as if it is being applied in discriminatory fashion, end of quote. Mr. Obama was, of course, the first Black president of the US, a status that in the eyes of many people made him the first post-racial president. I wrote a book that was 30% about this, and only me and my wife have read it, but you know, whatever. His stunning victory in the presidential election of 2008 encouraged many people, significantly, and to his credit, he wasn't one of them, to declare that the country had turned its back on racism, that race no longer mattered to US politics or culture, that we could chart a path into the future unencumbered by the baggage of our racial history. Again, I say, to his credit, he wasn't one of the people who thought that, refused that thought when it was presented to him. Most of the time, he's kind of happy to let people think that, but you know, when called on to comment directly on it, he refused that thought. All of that said, there Mr. Obama was on November 24, 2014, thrust back into the history that some people thought he had escaped, or helped us escape, into a history of things like blackness and whiteness and their bearing on death and justice. There he was, sharing the historical stage with mostly Black protesters in a mostly Black town with a mostly white leadership, who were protesting the death of another Black person at the hands of another police officer. The next day, Mr. Obama's former ally, Cornel West, declared to some of those same cable news cameras that the age of Obama was over. So I began by suggesting that I'm going to share with you some things that work for me, like the images that Toni Morrison recruits into her work. She finds those images in the sort of shards and fragments of American history and other places, and then build stories around them. I find the images in, and I take the language of images a little more straightforwardly than Morrison usually does. I have in mind visually striking images that were seared into my brain when I encountered them, and I build these chapters around them. I'm saying all of this now because I realize it's not in the prose, because I usually have a slide for this. The image in play here is, and I don't know if people saw this, if you did, maybe it was seared into your mind too. The press conference I mentioned was commemorated in many people's minds in screenshots and YouTube videos and other places of a split screen picture with Obama on one side talking about peace and calm and shit blowing up on the other side, or on fire on the other side, right? Now, there were lots of things that were happening in that space that were not about fires and explosions, but that's what the news cameras wanted us to see. So you have this split screen image, and that's the image I'm trying to dig into. The second president, very different image, Donald Trump standing behind plexiglass, was Donald Trump addressing a group of protesters in DC on January 6, 2021. He spoke shortly before some of those same protesters and many others violently invaded the US Capitol building in an odd and brutal attempt to discount the recently concluded federal election and block the transition of power to Mr. Trump's successor. The insurrection failed, though not for want of effort, and not without many injuries, some deaths, much property damage, and a great deal of political wrangling about what to do with the many politicians who encouraged the insurrectionists and the many ordinary citizens who accepted the encouragement. Given Mr. Trump's continued influence over US politics and the persistent popularity of the people and causes he endorses, it may seem odd to cite the January 6th insurrection as the end of anything, as I did when I started this section, right? This is what the end of an era looks like. The Trump administration ended, to be sure, but the Trump era is surely still ongoing. If anything, the insurrection clarified the real breadth and depth of Trumpism as a political force. But something should have ended on January 6th, and our inability to achieve that ending once and for all, our determination as a country to refuse the story that ends this way, is important. This inability and this refusal forced some of us to search in the darkness for a way to get to that ending. The insurrectionists were able to invade the Capitol building in part because, to put it very crudely, very few people really thought this sort of thing could happen. Many expert political analysts had noted from the beginning of Mr. Trump's rise that US political institutions were strong enough to contain him and block whatever he might try to unleash. The rule of law would out, and if that wasn't enough, there was a world of conventions and practices and norms that Mr. Trump would be too clumsy to navigate and too lazy to learn, and the machinery of governance would withstand him and outlast him. Except the machinery didn't contain him because he cared so little about it, and he empowered people who also didn't care about it and would simply treat the conventions and norms like rules of a game they decided not to play. He ignored the convention of deference to the foreign policy establishment or to any policy establishment. He appointed very odd people to very important roles. He sometimes didn't appoint people at all and instead let large federal agencies atrophy for want of staff. At other times, he filled very important roles with very smart people whose entire intellectual and professional lives were built around understandings of America's foundational norms and institutions that are very much at odds with the understandings that seem to lead to, and perhaps to require, the age of Obama. Some commentators suggested also that Mr. Trump's toxic blend of boorish, sexist, narcissistic, obtuse racism would eventually fall out of favor with the coalitions of supporters he'd cobbled together. He offered tax breaks and deregulation and judges and assorted other things that certain people wanted. But he would deliver in large part by stoking the fires of a race war. He would weaponize white resentment over perceived loss of standing relative to advancing minorities. He would weaponize white dismay over the real diminution in the quality of life that has come with the economic and political shifts of the last several decades. He would weaponize white nostalgia for the good old days when men were men and America was great. At some point, these commentators suggested that people seeking specific policy outcomes would have enough. They'd eventually get enough of what they wanted or grow weary of the shtick. They would withdraw their consent from the bargain they had reluctantly struck with hatred, know-nothingism, and crudeness. Except they didn't. Trump's congressional supporters parroted his claims about stolen elections and joined him in egging on the protesters. His share of the vote grew in the second election. The bargain with renovated white supremacy was apparently not as loathsome as the commentators thought. So what should have ended on January 6th has kind of been ending for some time. For many people, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, it never really got started, but we can talk about that later. January 6th made it much harder to pretend that America was something other than what it has repeatedly shown itself to be since at least 1877. People could no longer pretend, they could, it's harder, that the country was united around the value of multiracial democracy and around the institutions that the Second Reconstruction in the middle of the 20th century assembled to enshrine and protect this value. We could no longer, in good conscience, as easily, tell the story of a country that fought a civil war and spawned a civil rights movement to exorcise the demons of its founding, and that since then has been on a seamless upward march toward justice and light. In a way, for some people, this ending began at President Obama's split-screen news conference. Mr. Obama was meant to be the culmination of America's long tortured history of racial progress, who represented the civil rights movement's Joshua generation, finally entering the promised land that our many Moses figures, Fannie Lou Hamer, Martin King, Ella Baker, and so on, did not live to reach. The problem was that what Mr. Obama's presidency really represented was the breaking point in a tenuous détente. The election of 2008 seemed at first glance like an historic breakthrough. It seemed to signal the country's willingness to set aside old hatreds. But as political scientists have since demonstrated, I think in particular of studies by Tesler and Sears, the election really signaled the intensifying divisions that would burst into full view 8 years later. So I've spent a lot of time focusing on beginnings and endings because that was how many of us experienced the events that I've described. On one level, this is unremarkable. Human lives unfold between beginnings and endings. We don't live in undifferentiated stretches of evenly unfolding time, or we try not to, and when we can't, we complain about boredom and things. We experience the passage of time in peaks and valleys, in ebbs and flows, as our needs and interests and concerns and obsessions gather details and attention in uneven clumps that bunch like ill-fitting clothes. Beginnings and endings make time significant. They mark it off into segments, into dramas and stories and anecdotes and adventures. We at the time of our lives, we say, when something, a party, a trip, a game, begins, unfolds, and ends in ways that demand recollection and commemoration. We got a bunch of phrases like this. It was the best of times and so on, time flies and so on, watch the pot never boils and so on, all of which have found places in the English lexicon as monuments to what some of us would call temporality. One of these philosophers that I've mentioned noted that we live forwards and understand backwards, which means that we come to grips with our lives by telling ourselves stories about things that have already happened. This is unavoidable. By the time we start reflecting on what's going on has become what went on and is rapidly wasting away from us. Time's winged chariot and all that. Which is why our stories are so often nostalgic, devoting to holding the past close and turning the unfamiliar present into an outpost or a betrayal of the meaning of some fleeting moment. That's all boilerplate temporality phenomenology of time stuff. But beyond this basic orientation to the experience of time, the narrative structure of the events that I've tried to dig into, that I've taken as my inaugural images, matters in these cases because of the nature and the gravity of the stories they implicate. So it's the baseline sort of orientation to narrative sense of identity or whatever it is. And then there's a particular way it works in these cases. The story that should have ended on January 6, 2021 is a story of innocence in something like Baldwin's sense. It's a story of a society that refuses to know things it could and should know, and that acts as if not knowing these things is a mark of moral purity. But it's more than a story, it's a myth, not because it tries to account for divine creation, although it kind of does that too, but because it does the cultural and psychological work that myths do. The myth of American racial innocence explains important aspects of our social lives. It gathers rituals to itself, and most importantly right now, it demands that we, some of us, embrace the opportunity to turn ordinary happenings into events. Communities consecrate otherwise ordinary happenings and myths to advance certain visions of themselves and their prospects. We commit to certain arrangements of memory and then invite or require others to embrace these arrangements with us. That's why 1968 and 1776 and 1848 and 1989 continue to matter to people. It's why 9/11 means something now that it didn't mean on September 10th in 2001, though it already meant something to people in Chile, but we don't think of that in the US. It's why people convene on these days, on certain days every year, to say things like never forget and never again. We are made of memories, and we make our shared lives by working together to consecrate our memories. All of this puts me in mind of Alain Badiou, who says the following in his book, Philosophy and the Event. An event is something that brings to light a possibility that was invisible or even unthinkable. An event is not by itself the creation of a reality. It is the creation of a possibility. It opens up a possibility. It indicates to us a possibility that has been ignored. Everything will depend on the way in which the possibility proposed by the event is grasped, elaborated, incorporated, and set out in the world, end of quote. The fall of the Bastille, the Boston Tea Party, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Stonewall Rebellion are events in this sense. Everything depends on the way people carry forward the possibilities that those human actions unlock. Events in this sense don't simply happen, things happen. People cross a bridge, they dump tea into a harbor, they climb over a wall, and then we narrate those things to ourselves in ways that make them into events, and whether they stay events or slide back into the undistinguished flow of everyday happenings is up to us. As Badiou says, it depends. Why am I saying all of this? It's hard to remember now, but the upheavals in Ferguson, Missouri, that is to say the happenings with which President Obama shared his TV screen. That was an event. It is hard to remember now because so much has happened since, including the political shifts and developments that led to January 6th. But for a time, the word Ferguson seemed poised to carry the same kind of weight that we attach in the US to Appomattox, or people in other places attached to Dunkirk, or in the southern US we attach to Selma. These place names mark opportunity as much as or more than they mark geography or civic identity. If, as Badu says, events indicate possibilities, what did Ferguson indicate? And why did it indicate it with such power that you could find at that time so many journalists and commentators eager and willing to talk about the age of Ferguson? In an essay written shortly after Michael Brown's death, Eddie Glaude offers a suggestion. I quote him now. The fact of young Black folk in solidarity with others, organizing to transform the conditions of living in Ferguson, does not guarantee that we have awakened from the sleepwalking induced by the election of 2008, post-racial Obama election. We have to be faithful to what Ferguson and these powerful young people have revealed and incited. So one way to cash out what Professor Glaude is interested here, one way I and some others have tried to cash this out, is as an insistence on the kinds of dynamics that many of the Ferguson protesters were trying to bring to light. One of the things people often say is that one of the things that was crucial to people on the ground in Ferguson was that people coming in from outside to report on this sudden upheaval realized this is not sudden. People have been on the grounds fighting some of the things they were fighting at that time for quite a long time, right? And they were doing that in part because of the persistence and banality of some of the forces that led to the firestorm that we saw in 2014, right? So one of these things, for example, so a couple of things are particularly relevant. One is the continual and ongoing production of a sort of racialized vulnerability, right? So the cameras come when things catch on fire, when somebody's lying dead in the street. But those things only happen because over decades, we've created systems and structures in virtue of which, or as a consequence of which, some members of our community are routinely made more vulnerable to certain kinds of social pressures than others. Political scientist or theorist Lisa Miller has written beautifully about this. So that's one kind of thing. The other kind of thing that's particularly important right now, and Professor Glaude seems to have this uppermost in his mind, is an emergence of a certain kind of youth activism that dovetails, people write often about this now, that dovetails with a new openness to alternative ways of thinking about political economy, right? More people have removed the word socialism from the banned words list in their minds, right? Because clearly some things need to change. There's a way in which Ferguson represents these things. Right? Unfortunately, there is now a real threat that the Ferguson event will pass from living memory, swamped by the rush of subsequent crises. Events are like radioactive isotopes or fires or any other energy producing chemical reaction. They decay over time and lose their power to influence their surroundings. But one can add fuel to these fires to keep them burning and to sustain their influence. This is what holidays and commemorations are for. This is what stories and songs and cinematic historical fictions mean to do. It's also sometimes why we do things like what we're doing now. And this is one of the things I mean to suggest, that there's a way in which the kind of work I'm trying to put myself in a position to do and that I can't quite do with the tools I was trained to use is a way of insisting on the relevance and importance of this event, or the relevance and importance of insisting that these happenings be consecrated in the formative event. Ferguson meant different things to different people, as events always do. In this case, the different meanings map neatly onto certain deep and abiding social divisions. The divisions I have in mind here, of course, start with the ones people usually signal by talking about race. Whatever else Ferguson was about, whatever conditions and actions it seemed to justify to people on different sides of different debates, it was crucially about race. It was also, though not quite as obviously, about violence, especially in relation to the role of the state, of public agencies and actors in producing and preventing violence. It was also, of course, about other things, some of the things we've just talked about, from the evolving nature of political protest to the tight connection between the police motto, protect and serve, and someone else's motto, contain and control. Still, the clearest meanings of the Ferguson moment and the quickest way into discussing most of the other issues runs through the intertwined topics of race and violence. Race and violence have retained their prominence in US politics since August 2014, but they've done so in ways that exacerbate the threat of Ferguson's slide into irrelevance. I have two examples in particular in mind. One is the liberating effect that the 45th US president, Mr. Trump, has had on racist and xenophobic in, for example, violent confrontations in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, and in the horrific spectacle that for much of the time when I was working on this project, and in certain ways still, now stands in for US immigration policy. So that's one kind of thing. Another kind of thing that threatens to exacerbate the slide of Ferguson into irrelevance is the recurring drama of outrage, activism, and political paralysis that accompanies mass shootings, like the one in Las Vegas 2 months after Charlottesville, and in Parkland, Florida, after only 4 months after that. It's tempting to let these emerging dynamics and events, intervening events, the rise of white nationalism, persistence of gun violence, for example, obscure Ferguson from view. It's also dangerous. To engage with the Ferguson moment, to insist on the Ferguson moment, is to examine the forces that make Trump and Parkland possible. These forces enable armed white supremacists to prepare for mayhem in Charlottesville in full view of the armed agents of the state. They reinforce a commitment to guns at all costs and to the thought that the solution to violence is the threat or reality of more violence. They help explain why violence against innocent young people from all walks of life generates outrage in a way that violence against presumptively guilty young people from certain walks of life, like in places like Ferguson, does not. In deference to the tight connection between the Ferguson moment and the subsequent happenings that threaten to block it from view, one of the things I want to do by digging into this image in a way that will go beyond what I've said for you today, the project offers a model for keeping the Ferguson moment alive. This model involves turning the moment into an event. Lots of ways to do that. This is one. Using the event to signal the dangers of racial innocence, which would require a deeper engagement with Baldwin and with stories about epistemic justice and so forth. And cultivating the capacity in ordinary everyday people as much as possible, not just in activists or in scholars or in public officials, to see these dangers. So what I've been trying to suggest with this first image, so I'm going to segue swiftly to the second and then bring this to a close, is that one response to moments of crisis like this is to concentrate and commemorate some of the happenings that are involved in the crisis as events that allow us to tease out certain important meanings and keep them in view. That's one way of engaging something like the temporality of these moments, right? Embracing the degree to which our experiences of these moments unfold in time and harnessing that in a way that can do existential, political, ethical work for us, social theoretic work for us. That's one way. Another way is one that I'm just beginning to think about, and it dovetails more or less deeply with the kinds of things I'm interested in. I said at the outset of this talk that one of the things I wanted to do in the cases I'll work through with you today is lean a little more heavily than I will probably in the book on some of the theoretical interventions that occupy some of the same space. So I'm thinking now of some work in what people in Black cultural studies call Black temporality of crisis. And these are, I'm thinking in particular of a special issue of the journal South Atlantic Quarterly that came out in January of last year that was almost entirely about this and offered glimpses of scholars working in various ways to embrace what some of them called the analytical framework of Black temporality in crisis, right? The idea there is that something like what I've suggested begins with something like what I've suggested in the Ferguson case. One way to read what happened in Ferguson was as a very brief, very small opening for people who only paid attention to places like Ferguson when somebody died or when something was on fire. A very brief opening for people to see that the sudden outbreak of violence, right? The sudden violent spectacle. That's not really where the action is. That's not the story. The story is the routine production of vulnerability, right? So there was a moment, right, where people would tell stories about, well, why is Ferguson? Well, they would ask questions. Why is Ferguson like it is? And there were stories in the Washington Post and other places about, you got a city with 21,000 people in it with 31,000 active arrest warrants, right? Or citations of one kind or another. That's a very peculiar way to organize your municipality, right? And you only do it when you want to use your citizens as an ATM machine, right, to fund the operations of the government, right? And you're only able to do that when all of this happens in a particular context in which certain kinds of people are routinely disvalued and devalued, right? So we got a little glimpse of that. And then we decided to stop thinking about it, right? So the theorists of Black temporality of crisis begin with something like this thought, right? They say, some of them, something like this: if you take seriously the experience of the Black experience of time in this particular moment of crisis, you have to begin with the thought that the crisis is perpetual, right? And there's a way to cash this out using language from Benjamin, right? The thing you think is new is not new, right? You begin there. And then you ask a question about what you do with that recognition, right? So one of the things I've suggested is a response to this question. It's you tease out, you locate a way of teasing out the meanings that make this crisis what it is, and you insist on some of the happenings that allow you to build an event around this, so you can invite people into the picture of the world that privileges the story about these dynamics and so forth. That's my answer. But they give other answers that are super interesting. One of the answers is, most of the people who write in this special issue are literary theorists of one kind or another. So one of their default moves is to say, look at the Black historical, or look at the historical novel, right? Look at where the action is in the historical novel in the English language, in particular in the United States. And you find a lot of people writing about slavery, right? And they're doing it not because they want to recycle the trauma or rehash the trauma, but because in a spirit of what one theorist calls melancholy historicism, right? There is something in the past that has not been resolved, right? And the present is about grappling with that past. And so there's a way in which one might think there is value in engaging with this history, reclaiming time, right? One way to experience temporality, Black temporality in crisis, is to reclaim this time to tell different stories about it. There's a strain of this thought that also informs certain kinds of televisual representations. You think of the Watchmen series on HBO, right? You think of Lovecraft Country. There's a way in which fantasy narratives around things like superheroes have gotten caught up in this, right? The Watchmen story begins with the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, right? That's a very peculiar thing to have happen unless you take seriously the degree to which the present moment for many people involves an experience of reclaiming time, right? You might also want to tell a story about something like Bridgerton, but I don't like to talk about Bridgerton. If y'all want to talk about that, we can, but I don't want to go there. We can talk about that later if you want. So that's one response. Another response is another kind of reclaiming time in the spirit that Audre Lorde taught many people. Reclaiming time in the sense of reclaiming one's own time for the work of self-care, right? Refusing the clock time of Fordism or Taylorism or capitalism, advanced capitalism or something, and taking seriously the fact that, or the thought that, I don't have to organize my time the way you people want me to, right? And I've been duped into thinking I have to in ways that are bound up with certain kinds of anti-Black racial projects and so forth, right? So there's another kind of reclaiming time that can grow out of this commitment to Black temporality of crisis. And another, perhaps the most obvious response to the thought of Blackness in perpetual crisis is Afrofuturism as an aesthetic movement. And so there are ways, these are additional ways to grapple with the thought that I fear unclearly, to put at the heart of my engagement with that first image, right? The image is President Obama on split screen, which invites us to rethink a certain way of ordering time that we've been invited to take up by stories about post-racialism or something, right? And one way to grapple with this reordering of time is to take seriously the moment that was competing with President Obama for the screen at that moment, right? To take seriously the Ferguson moment as an event and to insist on it, return to it, even though we've been invited to set it aside. But there are these other possibilities. And I propose to, at one point, not today, think harder about how to orient myself to some of what's in play for them. One reason I haven't done it yet to this point is the reason it grows out of the idea that I borrowed from Adorno and Montaigne, right? So one of the things that happens in South Atlantic Quarterly and places like that is that these moves get bound up in the rituals of professional legitimation, right? So not only am I going to tell you a story about the reordering of time in light of Black temporality and crisis, I'm going to turn it into a theory, right? And I'm going to tell you the theory in capital letters and build a thing around it. And the architectonic move is the one that I want to resist. Which is why I've embraced the essay form. So I'm a little ambivalent about that move, but there are things that people making that move want to take up that are supremely interesting, and I propose to think harder about them in the future. Moving to case 2, and then swiftly to an end. I remember my second image as footage from a municipal camera of some kind. It might have been a security camera on a government building, might have been a smartphone video captured by someone with an uncommonly calm hand. But the second possibility puts the owner of the phone in range of the disaster I'm about to describe, and I prefer not to think of that. In this image, we see a road some distance away from the camera on what appears to be a waterfront, though who knows how far the water was from the road in normal times. A small white car moves across the road, left to right across the screen, along the road, left to right across the screen. It looks as if the camera for the morning traffic report is following some unsuspecting commuter on the way to work. But behind the car, moving toward it and toward the camera, is a wall of water. But to call it a wall is not adequate. It is less a wall than a mountain, a foreshortened, encroaching horizon. Any way it moves, but not the way a wave moves. It moves the way the other side of the world would move if the space between you and it suddenly folded in on itself. It towers over the road and over the car and hurtles implacably, somehow still glacially, toward the car and the road both. The car, meanwhile, keeps equably puttering along as if it has some hope of escape, as if a mountain of displaced ocean will notice this effort and reward it with a reprieve. The car leaves the frame before the water arrives. Watching this scene with eyes inspired by hope and trained by Hollywood, some part of me couldn't help but wonder about the end of the story. This is real footage. I think I haven't been able to find it anywhere, but from the tsunami that swamped Fukushima. The ultimate fate of the car should not be in doubt. There is no way it could have outrun the tsunami. The wave filled the screen, while the car was too small for me to make out or even count the occupants. I want to say that few of the people who died that day in Fukushima were directly in the path of the wave, like the occupants of the white car. But then I remember the size of the wave. Still, irrational hope or something like it made me wonder. And then, still under the tutelage of Hollywood, I wonder, before I made myself stop. I wonder now, before I make myself stop, what was going on in the car. I wonder what the occupants thought and said and believed and felt. Did they know what was about to happen to them? If they did, what did they feel? The white car in Fukushima haunts me because it raises the kinds of questions that too many people have to ask these days, though too few people actually do. When the entire ocean is bearing down on you, do you keep driving? If continuing to drive is all you can do, and all you can do will, for all you know, achieve nothing, do you keep driving? How does it feel when the only thing you can do turns out to be a very ordinary thing, but is nonetheless all you can bring to an extraordinary time? So I think in the spirit of pitting ordinariness against the prospect of devastation, or as Adorno says, disaster, I think of George Floyd calling on his mother as Derek Chauvin choked the life from him. I think of meteorologists, the ones I watch every day, treating multiple days of triple-digit Fahrenheit temperatures in the Pacific Northwest of the US, where this sort of thing should not happen, as a simple expression of Mother Nature's whimsy, like a few consecutive days of rain. I think of the vast majority of the people I know, myself included, continuing to drive our cars and fly in our planes. So sometimes we do this to get to places where we talk to other people about how to stop driving our cars and getting in our planes in order to lessen our impact on the faltering health of the Earth's climate. All of which is also to say, I think of the sense of hopelessness that can come, with the thought that one's life and world are headed towards Adorno's disaster, and that there's nothing to be done about it, not even totally rebuilding one's life and one's world from the bottom up. One reaction to this experience of hopelessness, one attempt to capture it in relation to the racial reckoning that forms such a large part of the current crisis in the US, is a school of thought known as Afro-pessimism. That school of thought collides with philosophical debates on the merits and value of hope in ways that will reward just a moment's reflection, and then I'll very swiftly conclude. There's a great deal to say about Afro-pessimism. A great deal would have to be said to make sense of it. I will just gesture at it using a couple of lines from its best-known expositor, Frank Wilderson. Frank Wilderson says in one place the following, and I quote him, "Afro-pessimism is premised on a comprehensive and iconoclastic claim that Blackness is coterminous with slaveness. Blackness is social death. Blackness as a paradigmatic position, rather than a set of cultural practices, anthropological accoutrements, is elaborated through slavery." End of quote. On this view, Blackness just is social death in the sense of that expression that descends from pioneering sociologist Orlando Patterson. It is a paradigmatic position, not just a set of cultural practices. Wilderson says this, but he does not say this to endorse a kind of quietism. He continues to block this thought, quoting him once more. "I am not suggesting that people themselves to the inevitability of social death. It is inevitable in the sense that one is born into social death, just as one is born into a gender or a class. But it is also constructed by the violence and imagination of other sentient beings. Thus, like class and gender, which are also constructs, social death can be destroyed. End of quote. Now, what does it take to destroy social death? Not entirely clear, at least from, particularly from Wilderson, less so from other Afro-pessimists. At a minimum, what it takes is a comprehensive act of, they don't put it this way, conceptual re-engineering, right? Which is the point of the equation of blackness with social death, right? All of these concepts you people are using in your political theories are bankrupt, right? There's a way in which this is a deeply romantic move, right? You can't keep talking that way and think you're going to get where you need to get. So the story about human rights, that's humanness is bound up with whiteness. So the category of the human is essentially bankrupt. So you cannot use that. Thank you, Professor Wilderson. What do I use instead? I don't have anything to say about that. Just got to do something else. That part doesn't really work for me, but the romantic impulse driving towards a comprehensive act of conceptual re-engineering in the face of an ever-present and overwhelming crisis, that's extraordinarily important, right? The question then is just what you do about it. Now, one of the things that happens as people engage in these debates around Afro-pessimism, one of the reasons I've turned to Adorno and Montaigne is that people get caught up in nearly scholastic debates about the value and nature of hope, right? Well, you're an Afro-pessimist. You must think there's no hope for us. No, I don't mean that. I think hope is bad because it leads you to bad places, but I think there are things we can do. Oh, well, that just means you're hopeful. No, I'm not hopeful. And so they get caught up in these debates that are more semantic than kinetic about where and how to find the resources for existential sustenance in the face of the crisis, and for epistemological reorientation in the face of the resources that sustain and create the crisis, right? They get caught up in debates about which forms of words will do the work. That's my view. I don't think any form of words has a monopoly on the prospect of doing the work well. If it works for you, great. If you can build a political program around it and find people to work with you, then great. The Afro-pessimist form of words does not work for me, even though it points to some very crucial things. I strongly prefer the kind of language you get from people like Cornel West, right? Cornel West says, yeah, optimism is a problem, pessimism is a problem. You want to find a space in between, and I'm going to find that space and articulate that space by digging into resources from traditions of thinking about tragic action, for example, right? So the right way to think of these things is to accept the permanent possibility of defeat, but also the permanent possibility that there's something one can do and one should try, right? That's a very crude gloss on it. In various places, Professor West talks about very early in his career, talked about revolutionary patience. There are ways to tease out a story like this from the Christian narratives that he's so interested in, but he finds, in my view, more persuasive arguments for this because if he does the Christian thing, he has to disavow the metaphysics and then turn into a Kierkegaard scholar, and that's a complicated move. And so he just goes to Chekhov, right? He goes to the Russian authors that he loves deeply, right? So he has a rich story to tell about how to find the resource for existential sustenance, and less so, but a little bit of the epistemological reorientation that doesn't require the sort of disguised linguistic proposal that comes with Afro-pessimism, right? You need to rethink everything you mean by human and freedom and hope and justice. You can't use any of that stuff, right? At which point they're left in the position of Marx not being able to tell us anything about what happens after the end of history, right? So all of that was to say, second image leads me into this reflection on what it means to try to persevere in the face of what looked like hopeless odds. There's one story about what to do in this space that is very popular now. I find deeply moving, but ultimately unconvincing in certain ways. There's a great deal more to say about that, but I just wanted to gesture a little bit about, or gesture briefly at what an engagement with that school of thought looks like for me. Swiftly to a conclusion. The thoughts I'm after lie somewhere in the space between two passages from the brilliant American novelist Richard Ford. The passages I'm interested in come from his 2010 novel, Wildlife, in which the narrator, a young man, dreams of wildfires taking his home and then says the following: I knew even in this dream that the world would spin on and we would survive, and the fire did not matter so much. I did not understand, of course, what it meant not to survive. End of quote. At another point, the narrator watches his father grapple with a sudden firing and, to some degree, unjust firing. The father loses his emotional balance for a moment, then recovers. He addresses his son, and the son replies. This is the exchange. First, the father. Don't be worried about things, he said. I feel calm now. Son replies, I'm not worried, I said. And I wasn't, because I thought things would be fine. And even though I was wrong, it is still not so bad a way to set your mind toward the unknown, just when you are coming into the face of it. End of quote. We look in moments of crisis for ways to set our minds towards the unknown. Our theories can help, but they can only take us so far. Sometimes, for example, in particularly dark times, we have to begin again, as Professor Glaude reading Baldwin encourages us to think. We have to look for new words, as Wilderson and C.D. Hartman and others encourage us to think. We have to unstiffen our theories, as William James encourages us to think, to give experience a hearing. I've tried to report on some experiments I've undertaken in this spirit, in the hope, here's a troublesome word again, that the report will cast some light on these dark times. Since, as Adorno learns from Goethe to say, we are destined to see the illuminated, not the light. Or, as I've learned from Howard Thurman to say, sometimes the darkness can itself be luminous. Thank you.